The cold had ruled the valley for 3 straight days, and it showed no sign of mercy. Colt Mercer had seen winters break men far stronger back when he scouted for the cavalry, and he'd learned that routine was the only thing that could keep death at bay in weather like this. At 38, with a bad leg and a cabin miles from the nearest mining trail, he couldn't afford to ignore his traps or let hunger sneak up on him. He left the cabin before dusk, leading his mule hitched to a narrow sled used for hauling pelts and game. He didn't speak to the animal. It wasn't the kind that needed words, but he kept a gloved hand near its neck as they crossed the hard-packed snow beneath the cottonwoods. The sun had vanished behind the ridge, and the last light was bleeding from the sky. Colt could read the land the way others read a map, his mind fixed on practical things, how many pelts he'd stack by the wall, how long the lantern oil would last, whether the snares by the creek might have caught something before the storm sealed them under ice. The wind cut across the flats, snapping his coat against his legs. He wasn't a man who panicked, but storms in this country could twist in minutes, and he hated being out in the open longer than he had to. The mule's breath rolled out in heavy fog. The only sounds were leather creaking and the crunch of ice. Colt Mercer wasn't out there to save anyone, and he sure wasn't looking for trouble. He ran those traps to make it through another month without heading into town, because town meant questions whiskey-soaked drunks, and memories he'd buried deep. His wife, Clara Mercer, had died 3 winters back, giving birth to a child who never drew breath. He'd buried both before the ground froze too hard and stopped talking to folks except when trading hides, powder, or beans. Being alone was a choice, not a curse. Halfway along the creek, he knelt to reset a sprung trap. Something had tripped it, but nothing stayed. He checked the teeth reset. The trigger wiped his knife clean and kept moving. Every step counted. Every breath measured. That's how a man outlived regret. By the time he reached the cedar ridge where the creek bent south, the sky had turned to slate. The wind shifted pitch. The mule flicked an ear and halted, muscles tightening. Colt paused, lantern lifted, eyes narrowing. The night was wrong. No coyotes, no owls, just wind, and something hidden inside it. A strange hush, like the whole world holding its breath. Then a sound, faint, rough, a broken rasp that twisted his gut. No animal made a sound like that. It was the sound of something dying. He stood there for a heartbeat, torn between leaving it to the snow or checking, and maybe bringing death to his own door. Survival made a man careful, but it also made him act when something deep inside said, "Don't walk away." He tied the mule's lead to a bent cottonwood root and climbed the short rise beyond the cedars. The lantern carved a narrow tunnel through the dark, and there they were, 2 figures half buried against a rock ledge, hair iced over clothing, stiff and torn. No movement at first. A curse slipped through his teeth. Finding bodies meant work, meant memories he didn't want. But then one of them stirred. The older woman blinked slow and heavy. Her lips were cracked and colorless. She didn't flinch when he crouched. Her eyes, dull from cold, but still alive, tracked him faintly. He recognized the features at once, Apache tribe of the Red Mesa. Dark hair, bronze skin under frost, the look of someone trained young to survive what others couldn't. The younger woman didn't move. Her hair was frozen across her face. Colt brushed it aside and pressed his glove to her neck. A pulse faint, but there. Ice cold, yet not gone. He didn't waste time asking how they'd ended up here. Answers wouldn't change a damn thing. He yanked the blankets from the sled, freed their limbs from the snow with numb fingers. The older one tried to help, once arms trembling before giving out. He ignored the sound she made, part breath, part pain, and carried them one at a time to the sled. He wrapped them tight, threw his own coat over the blankets, and tied the corners down so the wind couldn't steal them away. The mule stomped and snorted, but didn't fight the load. The storm grew sharper, snow slicing his face, darkness closing in. His leg throbbed where the old bullet had lodged years ago. He pushed through anyway. By the time he reached the cabin, the fire was nearly out, and his lungs burned raw. He dragged the younger woman inside first. Her skin felt like carved wood beneath his hands, and he prayed the heat would reach her in time. Her skin was stiff beneath his hands, first the younger, then the older, then. Colt Mercer didn't waste time worrying about modesty. The cold didn't care for it, and neither did death. He stripped away what was frozen, and soaked moccasins, shredded deerskin leggings stiff as bark, and covered both women with thick wool blankets near the stove. "Breathe," he muttered to himself, checking their hands and feet, pressing gently to see if the blood might still return. The older one watched him from half-lidded eyes. What he saw there wasn't fear. It was a quiet warning, a reminder that she wasn't helpless, just spent. Colt fed the fire with dry wood, the flames catching with a hiss. Their clothes hung dripping from a crossbeam, melting snow pattering into a tin pan. His own coat lay off, steam rising from his shirt as the heat soaked back into his bones. His mind wandered to the small grave under the cottonwood out back. Clara Mercer, and the little one Lily gone before life ever had a chance. Maybe that's why he hadn't walked away tonight. He said nothing aloud, just sat on the stool beside the stove, listening for more than breath. The older woman curled around her sister, protective, even in exhaustion. She winced once, but didn't speak. The younger one trembled under the blanket's color returning bit by bit. Colt told himself they were strangers, nothing more. Two women from the tribe of the Red Mesa, and trouble sure as thunder after lightning. There were plenty of men out here who'd kill him on sight just for sheltering them. Still, he didn't throw them back into the dark. Not while they were breathing. Survival, that's what he'd call it, if anyone asked. Fire traps, shelter, and silence. Nothing more. But survival also meant facing what was in front of you, not pretending it wasn't there. Outside, the storm slammed against the shutters till the nails cried. Inside, heat filled the cramped cabin, thick with the smell of wet hide. Colt watched the fire chew through the wood, listening to the soft rhythm of their breathing behind him. His heartbeat slowed, but he didn't let his eyes close. They were alive. That meant tomorrow decisions had to be made. By dawn, the wind had quieted, though the cold still bit deep enough to sting the lungs. Colt hadn't slept, just dozed against the wall, waking at every shift of wood or faint rasp of breath. When the fire dimmed in the night, he built it back up. He wasn't about to watch two half-dead souls slip away after dragging them out of the snow. When the first pale light crept through the frost-glazed window, he leaned closer. The younger woman, Sierra Moonshadow, though he didn't know that name yet, had sweat beading her brow and a flush rising back to her cheeks. Her lips had color again. Her breathing sounded wet but steady. The older one, Naya Redbird, had pulled her sister close, sharing what warmth they could. She stared at Colt as he bent near, not startled, not grateful, just measuring him. "You drink, you stay alive," he said, voice rough from the cold and the long night. She didn't answer, but her gaze flicked toward the iron kettle on the stove. Colt filled a tin cup with melted snow, warmed over the coals, and knelt beside them. When he touched Sierra's shoulder, her hand twitched. He slid an arm behind her, lifting her enough to press the cup to her lips. Some spilled down her chin. but she swallowed, eyes half open, uncertain if he was real. Naya pushed herself up on one elbow, reaching for the cup next. Colt handed it over without a word. Her fingers trembled as she drank not from fear, but from hunger, and the shock slowly fading. They hadn't spoken a word yet, but he could read the truth in their faces, Apache women survivors. He'd seen their kind before, scouts, warriors, families, during his years along the Rio Grande. He'd fought beside some against others. He didn't carry opinions anymore, only scars and silence. What he knew was simple. They were alive because he'd found them, and now they were under his roof. That meant responsibility, whether he liked it or not. Colt tossed another log into the fire, sat down, and pulled on his boots. The mule would need feed, and the barn door had drifted shut overnight. His leg throbbed, an old bullet's reminder of how cold steel stayed in the bone. But chores didn't wait for pity. Before stepping outside, he turned to Naya. "If you move, do it slow. Fire stays hot. Water's there." Her eyes followed his hand to the jug by the stove, then back to his face. She didn't nod, didn't speak, but he knew she understood. He pointed toward the jug by the stove. Her eyes followed his hand, then returned to his face. No nod, no word, but he knew she'd heard him. Outside, the world lay frozen in silence. Snow had piled high against the cabin walls and nearly buried the barn door. The sky hung pale and still, a sheet of cold light, every branch and fence post encased in glassy ice. Colt Mercer grabbed the edge of an old feed scoop and started carving a narrow path through the drifts. He cleared enough space to open the barn, then led the mule to the trough. The horses stamped and blew clouds of frost into the air, their tails flicking in irritation from the long night. Their water was frozen solid. Colt broke the crust with the back of the scoop, then returned to the cabin for a pail of hot water from the stove. When he stepped inside, the older woman had moved. She sat upright against the wall, now wrapped tightly in a blanket from chest to feet, eyes sharp despite the exhaustion. Her sister still slept breath shallow, but calm, no longer trembling like before. Colt set the pail beside the door and studied them for a long moment. He needed to know what kind of storm they'd dragged into his life, how long they'd been running, and who might be behind them. Out here, tracks in the snow had a way of leading to bullets. He crouched near the stove, voice low and steady. "Someone close." The woman didn't answer. Her gaze stayed locked on him, quiet, unreadable. He tried again. "Someone after you." Still nothing. No flinch, no blink. Just that same fire simmering behind her calm. Colt thought about his own rules. No strangers, no guests, no stories. But that line had already been crossed the moment he dragged them inside. He leaned forward, words turning cold and blunt. "If they find this place, we all die out here." That landed. Her jaw tightened, and for the first time she looked at her sister, then back at him. No words, but her eyes changed, not trust exactly, but understanding. The kind of silent recognition only those who'd seen death could share. Colt grabbed his coat from the peg. "I'll get food. Don't move her yet." She gave a single, slow blink, about as close to agreement as he'd ever get. Out in the cold again, he trudged to the small storage shed buried in the slope behind the cabin. Ice had sealed the latch, and he knocked it free with his fist before pulling the door open. Inside were the last scraps of smoked venison and a half sack of cornmeal, barely a week's worth if he rationed it right, less now with 3 mouths to feed. He felt the weight of that truth, but didn't turn back. When he returned, he set a skillet on the stove, tore the meat into strips, and added water and a pinch of ground chili from an old tin. The scent of stew filled the room, slowly curling through the air like hope. The younger woman stirred, eyes fluttering open for the first time since the rescue. She looked around Fire Blanket's door, then at him. Panic flared for a heartbeat before her gaze found her sister. Naya Redbird touched her cheek and whispered a word too soft for Colt to catch. Sierra Moonshadow's shoulders eased. Her breathing slowed again. Colt realized what most folks would have wondered by now, who these women were. How long they'd been out there. Why they were alone, and why a man like him who'd spent years hiding from the world had dragged them into his home instead of letting the snow take them. He thought back to the night before, the sound that cut through the wind, the way Naya's eyes had stayed open when she was half dead. Something in that look had pulled him forward before reason could stop him. He didn't regret it, but he knew it meant trouble. He set 2 tin bowls on the floor near them. "When she wakes proper, you feed her slow," he said. "If she throws up, wait before giving more." Naya nodded once, understanding enough. She didn't thank him, and he didn't expect her to. Colt ate, standing 2 small strips of meat chewed between watchful glances at the door, the window, and the women's breathing. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was thick with things none of them were ready to say. Finally, he spoke again, voice even. "You're safe here. For now. But if men come looking, I'll know before they reach the creek." He paused, eyes hard. "And I don't run." Naya's stare didn't waver. Her hand rested near her leg under the blanket like she wished there was a knife there. No fear, just calculation. Colt respected that. He didn't ask their names, didn't give his. But as the fire popped and the wind eased, he knew one thing for certain. The cabin didn't feel like his own anymore. And the quiet that followed wasn't going to last. By midday, the fire burned low. Colt added 2 more logs from the stack and broke down an old bunk slat to keep the heat steady. The room still held the night's warmth, but he knew it wouldn't last long. Neither would the peace. Every move Colt Mercer made, the older woman's eyes followed him. She had pushed herself off the floor while he was outside, and now sat upright against the wall, wrapped tight in both blankets, her sister tucked close beneath her arm. Even in her weakened state, her posture spoke plain. She was ready to fight or flee, if it came to that. Colt had expected questions, maybe fear, maybe anger. But instead the cabin was filled with silence, the kind that had weight to it. It made him wonder again what kind of nightmare had driven them into the snow. He knew the tribe of the Red Mesa didn't abandon their own, not in weather like this. And men didn't get far with captives in a blizzard unless they meant to use them or kill them. Sooner or later, someone would want answers. Who were these women running from? White men soldiers? Other tribes? Why no weapons, no horses, no tracks, except the ones the wind had buried? Colt figured he'd want those answers himself before long. The younger one stirred, still fevered, but awake, and tried to sit up without help. Colt crouched low, careful not to startle them. The older sister lifted her head in warning, but didn't pull the girl away. "She needs more water," Colt said evenly. "Something warm in her. Fever breaks quicker with heat." He pointed toward the tin mug by the stove. The older woman didn't take her eyes off him as she reached for it, testing the warmth with the back of her hand before lifting her sister's head and helping her sip. The girl coughed. Once, swallowed shoulders trembling beneath the blanket, but the water stayed down. Outside, the mule brayed restless in the cold. Colt pulled on his coat again, the ache in his bad leg already biting. Before he stepped out, he looked straight at the older sister. "If you can stand, move your toes. Frostbite'll take fast if blood quits moving. Same goes for her." She didn't answer, but he saw her shift under the blanket, flexing her feet, despite the pain tightening her jaw. Then she rubbed her sister's hands under the wool to keep them warm. Outside, the morning had turned bright and brittle. The kind of cold that looked beautiful, but killed a man if he wasn't careful. Colt checked the traps closest to the barn first. The storm had wiped most tracks clean, but one snare held a rabbit frozen stiff. It wasn't much, but it was meat. He brought it inside, dropped it on the table, then headed back out to check the creek traps. The wind had stilled, but his eyes swept the tree line for trouble. No smoke, no movement, no signs of riders, just ice crusting over the creek where the water used to run. When he returned, both women were awake. The younger Sierra Moonshadow had inched closer to the stove, soaking up its warmth. The older Naya Redbird sat straighter now, her back strong despite the pain in her limbs. She had pulled the kettle closer and set another tin cup beside it. They were conserving heat without being told. Survivors, not victims. Colt skinned the rabbit at the table, dropping the hide into a bucket, slicing the meat into strips. The scrape of his knife drew their attention, but neither flinched. Sierra watched him openly now, her eyes clearer, though her breathing still caught in her chest. When she coughed, it was deeper raw, but she stayed steady. He glanced at their feet, red, swollen, painful, but no blackening. They might keep every toe if circulation held. He cooked the rabbit with a bit of cornmeal in the same skillet from before. When it was ready, he motioned toward Naya. She hesitated only a heartbeat before breaking the meal in two, giving the smaller share to Sierra. They ate quietly, chewing slow so their stomachs wouldn't turn after days of hunger. When they finished, Colt asked the question that had been waiting since the night before. "Anyone coming for you?" Naya lifted her chin slightly, then shook her head once firm, certain, not afraid. Colt's voice softened. "Was it men who drove you into the snow?" For a moment, nothing moved but the firelight. Then Naya reached for her sister's wrist, steadying her. Her lips stayed silent, but her hand spoke clear. She mimed the pull of a trigger pointed west, then touched her shoulder where a faint scar hid beneath the blanket. That was enough. Colt understood. Gunfire. Men from the west. A wound earned while running. No tribe behind them. No one left following. Just the storm, and now him. Every move Colt Mercer made, the older woman's gaze was fixed on him. She had managed to shift off the floor while he was outside, and now sat upright against the wall, wrapped tightly in both blankets, her sister tucked close under her arm. Even with frozen feet and no strength to run, her posture said she was ready to fight or flee if it came down to it. He'd expected fear, maybe anger questions about what would happen next. But instead silence filled the room. That silence gnawed at him, made him wonder what had brought them into the snow in the first place. He knew the tribe of the Red Mesa didn't leave their own behind, especially not in weather like this. And men didn't get far with captives in a storm, unless they intended to use them or kill them. Sooner or later, someone would ask questions. Who were they running from? White men. Other tribes. Soldiers. Why, no weapons, no horses, no tracks, except those covered by the wind. Colt thought he might need those answers too, especially if the younger woman, Sierra Moonshadow, stayed fevered, but conscious. As she tried to sit up on her own, Colt moved slow, careful not to startle them. The older sister shifted her eyes, narrowing in warning, but she didn't pull Sierra away. "You need more water," Colt said softly. "Get something warm in her. Fever breaks faster with heat." He pointed to the tin mug by the stove. The older woman didn't look away from him, but she reached for the mug, testing its warmth with the back of her hand. She lifted Sierra's head and let her sip, the younger woman coughing once, before swallowing, her shoulders shaking under the blanket. But she kept the water down. Outside, the mule brayed restive in the cold. Colt pulled on his coat again. Before stepping out, he looked at the older sister. "If you can stand, try moving your toes. Frostbite takes quick if the blood quits moving." She didn't answer, but he saw her shift slightly under the blanket, flexing her feet, even though it made her jaw tighten in pain. She rubbed her sister's hands under the wool, her quiet determination clear. The sky outside was bright but brittle, the kind of cold that looked harmless but would gut a man come nightfall. Colt checked the traps near the barn first. The storm had wiped most tracks clean, but one snare had caught a rabbit. Frozen solid, but still meat. He brought it inside, set it on the table, then stepped back out to check the creek traps. The wind had died down, but his eyes stayed alert, scanning the tree lines and low draws for signs of movement. He didn't see anything. No tracks, no smoke, no distant rifle shots. When he returned, both women were awake. Sierra Moonshadow had moved closer to the stove, trying to soak up what warmth she could. The older sister, Naya Redbird, sat up with her knees under the blanket, back straight, despite the pain. She had dragged the kettle closer and set another tin cup beside it. They were conserving heat without being told. Survivors, not victims. Colt skinned the rabbit at the table, the sound of his knife scraping against the wood drawing their attention. Neither flinched. Sierra's eyes were clearer now. She coughed from her chest. Not her throat, but the wince told Colt that something deeper still ached. He checked their feet as he worked, pretending not to, but keeping his eye on them. The skin was still raw, but the color had returned to their toes. No blackening yet. He cooked the rabbit with cornmeal in the same skillet from before. When it was done, he motioned for Naya to eat first. She broke the portion in half, handing the smaller share to Sierra. They ate in silence, but they ate slowly, savoring it, knowing it might be the last meal for a while. When they were done, Colt asked the question that had weighed on him since the night before. "Anyone coming for you?" Naya lifted her chin slightly, then shook her head firm, certain, without hesitation. Colt's voice dropped lower. "Was it men who drove you into the snow?" For a moment, neither woman moved. Then Naya reached for her sister's wrist as if to ground her. Without speaking, she used her hand to mime the motion of firing a rifle. She pointed west with 2 fingers, then touched her shoulder where a scar hid beneath the blanket. That was enough for Colt. Gunfire, someone from the west, a wound from fleeing, no tribe chasing them, no one left behind. He nodded to himself, understanding what others might have been wondering from the start. Were they being followed? Was he sheltering fugitives? Were killers on their way? For now, the answer was no. Colt stood, grabbed his rifle, and set it by the door where it always rested. Then he pulled the skillet from the shelf. He had just enough cornmeal left for one more mash before the supplies ran out. He mixed it with water, tore a strip of the dried venison, and stirred it all over the heat. "You're not prisoners here," he said without looking at them. "But don't open that door unless I say. Storm or no storm, there's wolves and worse than wolves out there." Naya didn't react to the warning, but she glanced at the latch and then at the rifle. She understood. Sierra coughed softly deep in her chest, and Colt knelt near enough to check her hands and feet again. The skin was raw, but the colors still held. She winced, but didn't pull away when he pressed gently on the worst cracks. He didn't ask permission. There wasn't time for small talk, but Colt Mercer noticed the older woman's sharp eyes on every movement of his hands. When the food was ready, he slid their plates toward them and sat down with his own. He ate, standing, leaning a hip against the table, watching how they handled the meal. They ate slowly again, giving most of the broth to the younger one. Something about the way the older woman carried herself made Colt think she understood more English than she let on. He tested the idea without calling it out. "You got names?" he asked plainly. Both women froze, not in fear but in calculation. The older woman studied his face carefully. Then, after a long moment, she spoke one word. Taya Colt repeated quietly in his head. "Taya," he said, then pointed slightly at the younger woman. Taya hesitated, then gently brushed a hand across her sister's arm. "Nomi," she said. Nomi, still half wrapped in blankets, leaned on Taya's side. At the sound of her name, Nomi lifted her gaze to him. She didn't speak, but she didn't look away either. Colt didn't introduce himself. Not yet. He wasn't sure if telling them his name would make things safer or harder. Instead, he offered the only truth he could live with for now. "You'll stay until you can walk," he said. "After that, if you want to leave, I won't stop you. But if you stay, you pull weight just like me." Taya didn't nod or speak, but the tension in her shoulders eased a little. Colt finally gave them the only thing they would need to move forward: his name. Colt Mercer. Nomi blinked slowly, testing the sound of it. Taya didn't repeat it, but her jaw loosened, as though a question that had been hanging in the air since the night finally settled. Colt decided to address something unspoken, something listeners might wonder. He'd lived enough years around scouts and raiders to know the difference between someone lying in wait and someone clawing to stay alive. "If you meant me harm," he said flatly, "you would have done it when I took your boots off. We won't waste time watching each other like enemies unless something changes." Taya didn't respond immediately. She glanced at the stove, then back at him. No agreement, but no resistance either. The rest of the day passed in silence. Colt went outside, chopped wood, repaired the barn door hinge, and restacked the sled. Inside, Taya helped Nomi stand twice, holding her under the arms, while the younger woman's feet trembled with every movement. Nomi's breath hitched with pain, but she didn't make a sound loud enough to draw attention. When Colt returned and saw them standing even briefly, a thought crossed his mind, but he didn't speak it out loud. They weren't guests. They were survivors just like him. And survival worked better when everyone knew their role. Colt added another log to the stove and checked his rifle before evening set in. No tracks in the snow, no riders in the distance. The quiet held for now, but the cabin no longer felt like a place for just one person. And Colt knew that whatever came next wouldn't bring things back to how they were before they arrived. By the third morning, the cabin smelled of wood smoke, wet hides drying near the stove, and bodies recovering from the cold. Colt woke before daylight again, not by choice, but because habit kept him awake at the first stir of wind or change in temperature. His coat was still on from the night before, and his back ached from sleeping half upright in the chair. The fire had dimmed to embers. He fed it slowly, careful not to bring the heat up too fast. He didn't want to make the women cough or faint. Nomi was breathing easier, but the deep rattle in her chest still lingered. He knelt beside her, pressing 2 fingers gently to her neck to check her pulse. Taya's eyes opened at the movement. She didn't reach for his arm or speak, but her body tensed the way someone reacts when danger feels closer than sleep. "She's warm enough," Colt said, not expecting a reply. "But that cough stays. She needs broth and rest." Taya didn't blink, but her jaw loosened slightly. Nomi stirred, trying to turn on her side. Colt adjusted the blanket without touching her bare skin. The wood crackled in the stove, filling the silence. By now, Colt knew there were things anyone listening might wonder. How long had these women been without food? Did they have family in the camp that had been attacked? Had they lost more than just the wound on Taya's shoulder? And the other question, one that hung between them quietly, would Nomi's fever leave her weak enough to die from it anyway? Colt didn't voice the thought. Instead, he shaped the morning around it. He set a pot of water on the stove, adding what was left of the smoked rabbit bones and a handful of ground corn. It wasn't much, but he wasn't feeding himself before them. There was no resentment, just the steady acknowledgement that his supplies wouldn't last more than a week, if the storm kept them all here. After stoking the fire, Colt Mercer moved his spare cot from the storage corner and set it closer to the stove. He stripped his own blankets off the bunk and laid them over the frame so Sierra Moonshadow wouldn't have to lie on the cold wood floor. Naya Redbird watched him do it. Her brow furrowed like she was trying to decide whether there was a price to follow. "I won't lose her to the cold inside after dragging her out of it," Colt said, his voice steady. "If she can stand better off the ground, we use the cot." Naya shifted slowly and helped Sierra sit upright. The younger woman's legs shook, but her color was stronger today. Colt offered his arm out, not grabbing, just placing it near enough for balance. Naya hesitated only for a breath, before guiding Sierra to lean on him. With a careful motion, Colt lifted Sierra and settled her gently on the cot. Then he stepped back, without lingering. Sierra's breathing stayed steady, her eyes half open, no longer dazed as they had been before. Colt could tell she was listening now, not floating somewhere between sleep and gone. He poured the broth into a tin bowl and handed it to Naya. She tested the heat with the back of her hand, then fed Sierra small spoonfuls. Sierra swallowed without choking. Colt caught himself unclenching his fists. Then he addressed the next concern, before it could become a problem: water bathing and infection. Listeners would ask if the frost-bitten limbs had been cleaned, if the wound on Naya's shoulder risked infection, and why he hadn't already tended to it with salve. He pointed toward the metal basin by the stove. "When she finishes eating, I'll heat water. The wound on your arm needs washing. Infection in this cold kills faster than hunger." Naya's eyes flicked to her shoulder, then cautiously returned to his face. She didn't object, but she didn't agree either. Colt didn't push. Instead, he gathered clean strips of cloth from the small trunk near his bunk-old shirts he'd cut for binding wounds over the years. He set them on the table, showing he wasn't hiding anything. When the broth was gone, he filled the basin with hot water. He waited until she moved first. Naya loosened her dress with one hand, tugging the fabric past the scab on her shoulder. Colt stayed a few steps back, giving her space, but staying close enough in case she lost her balance. The injury wasn't fresh. The graze was scabbed, swollen around the edges with bruising that ran into her back. A rifle shot, not close range, likely fired while fleeing. "You clean it, she helps," Colt said, nodding toward Sierra. "I bring cloth when it's ready. If it breaks open, I stop the bleeding. No more than that." Naya paused, then nodded once, without speaking. Colt stepped away to give them privacy, and checked his rifle by the door, wiping condensation from the barrel and testing the sights. When he returned with the cloths, Naya had already washed most of the dried blood away. Sierra held the edge of the blanket around her sister's back, steady, even with her weakened arms. Colt offered the cloth without reaching for it. Naya took it and bound her shoulder with slow, practiced movements. Not fancy, but tight enough to stop the strain. That told Colt she'd seen wounds before, maybe on others, maybe on herself. By midday, the air inside had warmed a little. Naya tested her legs, trying to stand without bracing on the wall. She managed a few steps before gripping the chair for balance. Colt pointed toward the bench by the window. "Sit there for a while," he said. Muscles worked better on wood than dirt. Naya didn't thank him, but she followed the direction. The afternoon passed in quiet tasks, the kind that answered questions without speaking them. Colt stepped outside with his rifle to check the ridge trail and the tree line above the creek. From there he could see half a mile of snow and rock. No riders, no smoke, no prints larger than rabbit tracks near the brush. Whoever had chased these women wasn't close enough to leave a mark. Back inside, Sira slept without moaning, her breathing steady. Naya sat upright with the blanket over her lap. Her eyes followed Colt each time he crossed the room. Her suspicion hadn't vanished, but it had changed shape, less sharp, more deliberate. Colt boiled water again as evening fell and set more cornmeal to cook, rationing each portion smaller than before. They'd need to cut strips of deer hide from the storage shed by tomorrow to make it stretch. Before the lamps went out, Colt spoke directly to Naya, answering a question no one had voiced, but that anyone would think. "Why bring you back at all, instead of leaving you where I found you?" "I knew someone once," Colt said, quietly fixing the latch on the door. "I buried her after the snow took her. I don't bury another if I can help it." Naya stared at him for a long moment. He didn't look back. He just set another log on the fire and sat near the door with his rifle across his knees. Whatever doubt remained in the room, the air around it had changed. Sira Moonshadow was alive. Naya Redbird was sitting upright, and Colt Mercer had made it clear without asking for anything in return that they weren't a burden he'd toss back out into the cold once their legs could hold them. The night settled, but the quiet in the cabin no longer carried the same distance between them. The fourth morning came with clearer skies and a hard crust over the snow outside. Colt stepped out before the sun crested the ridge, pulling the cabin door tight behind him. The cold bit straight through his coat seams, but his boots broke the ice beneath them with solid footing. He checked the lean-to first. No fresh tracks from animals, the mule chewing slowly, the horses restless but unhurt. The storm had sealed most signs from the air, but Colt's instincts hadn't dulled. He scanned the tree line twice, then circled the cabin's perimeter, searching for any sign that someone had passed through during the night. Nothing. Inside the stove still gave off heat from the cold bed of coals he had banked before sleeping. Naya was awake, not startled, but alert. Her blanket was still wrapped tightly around her waist. Sira was sitting up, coughing softly into her hands. The sound was still deep, but not tearing at her lungs like it had on the first day. Colt set his rifle by the door and moved straight to the stove. He poured what was left of the boiled broth from the night before into 2 tin cups, added water, a scrap of rabbit fat, and set it back over the flame. The food was nearly gone. The meat wouldn't stretch more than another day. The cornmeal was almost empty. If the weather held, he'd need to hunt, but he wasn't leaving the cabin unguarded with 2 half-healed women inside. Colt knew people would wonder why he hadn't gone to town for more provisions. Why hadn't he taken them to town? The answer was simple. No town within 30 miles would shelter 2 Apache women, and no lawman would ask questions before deciding they were trouble worth removing. He filled a mug and motioned to Naya first. She tested the heat, passed it to Sira, then took a few sips herself. They both swallowed, without hesitation. Hunger had stripped hesitation from the equation. Colt sat on the stool and finally asked what had been left unspoken for too long. "You had people before this," he said. "Family tribe camp, someone besides each other." Naya held his gaze. She didn't speak right away. It wasn't reluctance, but more like she was measuring what could be said without breaking something inside herself. Then she raised 2 fingers, pointed behind her, toward the west again, and swept her hand downward as if flattening the air. gone, she said, with a finality in her gesture. All of them dead or scattered. Sierra didn't look up, but her fingers twisted slowly in the corner of the blanket. Colt watched and let silence fill the space. He understood enough without words. Raiders, settlers, mercenaries, renegades, there were plenty who took Apache camps apart for sport, for stock, or out of fear disguised as righteousness. He'd ridden with men like that years ago, left that life behind, but the knowledge never left him. "I won't let anyone track this place," he said, his voice steady. "If men come, they don't leave walking." Naya's brows furrowed, not in doubt, but as if trying to decide if he truly meant it. The truth was, Colt had killed before, and he would do it again without hesitation if anyone crossed his door with a rifle and a reason. Once the cups were empty, Colt divided the morning into tasks. "You stay with the fire," he said to Sierra. "Keep your feet on the floor, not tucked under. Blood has to move." She understood enough. Understood. Slowly, she slid her legs out from under the blanket and winced when they touched the cold wood. Naya added, "You stand and walk the fence inside the room, 10 steps at a time. If you stay off your feet, they'll fail you later." Sierra didn't argue. She stood slow, steadying herself with a hand on the table. Her face tightened with pain, but she moved, dragging the blanket behind her like a shawl. Colt pulled on his coat again and lifted the trap bag from the peg. He didn't plan to go far, just as far as the first line of snares he'd set in the brush before the storm hit. Rabbits might have moved now that the wind was gone. Before leaving, he addressed something else a listener might still question. "Trust," he said, motioning to the rifle, leaning against the door. "I leave the rifle here. If trouble comes, bolt the door and light the lamp. I'll hear a shot if you fire once." Naya's eyes flicked from the rifle to him. It was a strange offer in any other circumstance, for a white man to leave a firearm within reach of 2 Apache women he'd just met. But Colt read the room differently than most would. If Colt Mercer had meant any harm, he'd have done it already. He'd have slit his throat while he slept near the fire. But there was no sign of malice, only a silent understanding between them. He closed the door behind him and moved through the snow toward the brush line near the creek. The crust of snow held his weight for the most part, but he stuck to the mule path to avoid sinking too deep. The first 3 snares were empty, but the 4th had caught a snowshoe hare still alive, but trapped by the leg. Colt snapped its neck clean and stuffed it into his bag. The cold would preserve it for now. On the way back, he checked the ridge once more, scanning for smoke tracks or any glint of metal. Nothing but white and quiet. Back inside, Naya Redbird and Sierra Moonshadow were seated on the cot. They were watching the door when it opened. No fear, just readiness. Colt skinned the hare over a basin, laid the hide flat to dry, and cut what meat he could salvage. The bones went into the pot for stew, and the rest he salted lightly and placed on a tin pan near the stove. With food handled for the moment, he turned his attention to their clothing. Their dresses were torn beyond repair, and the blankets wouldn't last long if they needed to move outside. He dragged a storage crate from under his bunk and pulled out 2 old shirts, a spare coat missing buttons, and a pair of leggings he'd taken off a dead prospector years ago. He didn't hand them over like charity. He laid them on the table as tools, not gifts. "They aren't much, but they'll cover you until I can make better ones," he said. Naya didn't touch them at first, but Sierra reached slowly, running her fingers over the wool sleeve. Colt pretended not to watch, but his hands worked swiftly, cutting the larger shirt down to size, leaving room for stitching once Naya's hands were steady enough to do it herself. He had expected suspicion, but hunger and exhaustion had dulled that edge. Beads, lace, and deerskin meant something different to them now. Survival meant warmth and memory. As the afternoon light slanted through the frosted window, Colt finally spoke the thing that had been hovering in the silence between them since they met. "When you both can stand and walk far, we'll decide if you stay here or find another place." He didn't say when. He didn't press for which. But leaving it unspoken would have felt like a sentence. Syrah's breathing no longer hitched when she swallowed. Naya sat still beside her, her shoulders straight and listening without answering. Colt cleaned the knife, fed the fire again, and looked at the door like he always did before dark. The cabin no longer felt like a temporary refuge. The silence was still there, but it wasn't the same emptiness it had been before. Outside, the sky held no storm, yet inside the silence had settled between them, waiting, not covering. Colt knew whatever choices came next would be different than anything he had planned before they arrived. By the 5th morning since he dragged them out of the snow, the cabin didn't feel like it was holding strangers. It wasn't familiar yet, but the edge of fear had dulled. Colt woke to the sound of controlled coughing. Syrah was sitting upright on the cot, covered to the waist. Her breath was still rough, but not catching in her chest like before. Naya sat beside her legs folded under the blanket, her hair unbraided for the first time, leaning closer to the stove's heat. Colt stoked the fire and quietly counted the remaining food, 2 hairs salted on a tin sheet, 3 handfuls of cornmeal, and the strip bones he'd set aside, not enough for another 3 days. If Naya and Syrah were well enough to help themselves, they'd need more than rationed portions. That meant planning. "When the sun gets high, I'll hunt further out," he said, setting the kettle on the stove. "Won't be long, but you keep the door barred unless it's me." Naya listened, her face unreadable, but she didn't argue. Syrah drank from the tin cup and lowered it slowly, swallowing easier than she had yesterday. Her eyes followed Colt with more clarity now, and something close to awareness settled into her gaze. Before leaving to hunt, Colt addressed the question that had been hanging between them. It wasn't curiosity. It was something he needed to know. "How many men attacked you?" he asked plainly, and why Naya didn't answer at first. Her shoulders tensed as she decided whether to give him anything. Then, without words, she lifted her hand, showing 3 fingers. She lowered one, then another, leaving one raised. "1 man left alive," she said, without speaking, then pointed west farther this time, beyond the ridge, beyond the cottonwoods. Colt understood. 3 men had come, but 2 were dead either by their hands or someone else's. 1 man still breathed somewhere far behind them, but not close enough to find tracks under miles of snow. Syrah's gaze dropped at the memory, her fingers tightening around the blanket. Colt looked at her briefly, then back at Naya. Syrah Moonshadow was still alive, and Naya Redbird had kept herself upright. Colt Mercer had made it clear, without asking for anything in return, that they weren't a burden he'd toss back out into the cold once their legs could hold them. The night settled, but the silence between them shifted. It wasn't just quiet anymore. The 5th morning came with clear skies and a hard crust of snow underfoot. Colt stepped out before the sun rose over the ridge, leaving the cabin door tightly shut behind him. The cold bit through his coat, but his boots cracked the ice beneath him with steady steps. He checked the lean-to first. No fresh tracks, just the mule chewing slowly, the horse twitching with restlessness but uninjured. The storm had erased most signs, but his instincts were still sharp. He scanned the tree line twice, then circled the perimeter of the cabin, looking for any hint that someone had passed through the night. Nothing. Back inside, the stove still gave off heat from the cold bed of coals he'd banked before sleeping. Naya was awake, alert, with her blanket wrapped around her waist. Sira was sitting up, coughing softly into her hands. The sound was still deep, but not tearing at her chest like it had on the first day. Colt set his rifle by the door and went to the stove. He poured the remaining broth from the night before into 2 tin cups, added some water and a scrap of rabbit fat, and set it back over the flame. Food was nearly gone. Meat wouldn't last more than another day. Cornmeal was almost empty. If the weather held, he'd have to hunt. But Colt wasn't leaving the cabin unguarded with 2 recovering women inside. He knew folks might wonder why he hadn't gone to town for more supplies. Why hadn't he taken them there? The answer was simple. No town within 30 miles would shelter 2 Apache women, and no lawman would ask questions before deciding they were trouble to be dealt with. He filled a mug and motioned to Naya first. She tested the heat, passed it to Sira, then took a few sips herself. They both swallowed without hesitation. Hunger had long since stripped any hesitation away. Colt sat on the stool and asked the question he'd left unspoken for too long. "You had people before this," he said. "Family tribe camp. Someone besides each other." Naya met his gaze. She didn't speak right away. It wasn't reluctance. It was more like she was weighing what she could say without breaking something inside. Then she lifted 2 fingers pointed behind her toward the west and swept her hand downward as if flattening the air. "Gone," she said softly. "All of them dead or scattered." Sira didn't look up, but her fingers twisted slowly in the corner of the blanket. Colt didn't say a word. He understood more than he needed to. Raiders, settlers, mercenaries, renegades. There were plenty of men out there who would take an Apache camp apart, for sport, for stock, or out of fear disguised as righteousness. He'd ridden with men like that before left that life behind, but the knowledge never left him. "I won't let anyone track this place," he said, his voice firm. "If men come, they don't leave walking." Naya's brow furrowed, not in doubt, but as though she was calculating the risk. Colt had killed before, and he would again, if anyone crossed his door with a rifle, and a reason. Once the cups were empty, Colt divided the day into tasks. "You stay with the fire," he said to Sira. "Keep your feet on the floor, not tucked under. Blood has to move." Sira understood. Slowly, she slid her legs out from the blanket, wincing as they touched the cold wood. Naya added, "You stand and walk the fence inside the room 10 steps at a time. If you stay off your feet, they'll fail you later." Sira didn't argue. She stood slow, steadying herself with a hand on the table. Her face tightened with pain, but she moved, dragging the blanket behind her like a shawl. Colt pulled on his coat again and lifted the trap bag from the peg. He didn't plan to go far, just as far as the first line of snares he'd set before the storm hit. Rabbits might have moved now that the wind had died. Before leaving, Colt addressed something that had sat unspoken. "Trust," he said, motioning to the rifle resting by the door. "I leave the rifle here. If trouble comes, bolt the door and light the lamp. I'll hear a shot if you fire once." Naya looked from the rifle to him, her expression unreadable. In any other circumstance, it would have been strange for a man like Colt to leave a firearm within reach of 2 Apache women he barely knew. But he read the room differently than most. Naya Redbird watched Colt Mercer closely, her eyes flicking from the fire to the door and then back to him. She didn't ask why she'd already understood. If they were going to survive the winter, they couldn't sit on the floor waiting for the last of their food to vanish. They had to move, breathe the cold air, and become part of the land again. Colt ladled out the last of the rabbit stew from the night before. Thin but hot, with scraps of meat and broth clinging to the tin. Sira Moonshadow ate slowly, her hands steadier than the day before. Naya Redbird finished her portion without pause. Before stepping outside, Colt grabbed his rifle strapped on his coat and looked at them. "You stay with her," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'll check the rise. If I call you, hold the door, pull her behind the stove." Naya didn't reply with words. She just nodded once, sharp and sure, like someone used to following orders when they made sense. Sira tightened the coat around her shoulders and watched Colt go with clear eyes, not the dull haze she had when he found her. The cold bit Colt's lungs fast, but his breath came easy enough. The world had changed overnight. The snow was crusted firm underfoot. No new tracks. No broken branches from passing horses. He moved along the ridge trail in a slow arc, checking the high points where the land offered a clear view both ways. From there, he scanned the valley, the creek bed, the cottonwood stands. No smoke, no riders, no tracks moving in or out. When Colt returned, he didn't speak right away. He took off his gloves, then pointed to Sira. "You first, just to the lean-to and back." Naya stepped forward like she was about to argue, but stopped when he added, "She breathes better," moving before the cough roots again. Sira didn't wait for any more words. She stood unsteady at first, and then took Colt's hand not for trust, but for balance. He opened the door slowly, letting the cold hit her face in a steady rush, giving her body time to adjust before stepping out into the crisp air. Her feet crunched over the hardened snow each step, careful but strong. Colt walked beside her, but didn't hold her unless she faltered. She didn't. They made it as far as the lean-to, where the mule chewed slowly, and the horses stamped quietly. Sira leaned on the fence rail for a moment, catching her breath, then straightened up on her own. No words passed between them, not yet. Listeners might wonder when or if a bond began to grow between Colt and the women beyond the survival instinct. Did Sira see him as a savior, a stranger, or something in between? But in that moment, neither of them looked at the other with expectation. They just endured the cold together and turned back inside. Inside, Naya worked at a strip of hide in her hands, keeping her fingers alive. When Sira stepped in, the tension in Naya's shoulders eased just a little. She touched her sister's arm, checking for shivers or strain, then looked at Colt. "My turn," she said quietly, surprising him with English she hadn't used before. Colt didn't react. He just opened the door again. Naya walked without reaching for help, though each step on her shoulder made her wince. She hid it well. Outside, Colt kept pace a step behind her. She stopped at the same fence rail, bracing her hand on the top board, letting the cold fill her lungs. Her eyes scanned the ridge, the trees lining the ground, not searching for a way out, but hunting for any threats. When they went back inside, the questions that listeners might have had about language, about how much Naya truly understood, were answered in the quiet. She had known enough from the start. She had just chosen silence until her strength returned. Colt laid fresh wood on the fire and finally spoke what had been coming for days. "When the snow breaks, I'll take you both to the low country. There's a traitor there who won't fire on sight if he sees you with me. Supplies will last longer if we make that run." Naya looked at him with a stillness that wasn't fear or refusal. She didn't lower her eyes, but neither did she argue. Colt added, "If you run before, then you won't make it a mile before Frost or men find you. So you stay here. You follow my rules. You eat what we have, and I'll keep this roof standing." It wasn't a bargain. It was just the plain layout of how the world worked beyond the walls. Sira's voice broke the quiet for the first time in days. "We stay." Naya didn't argue. She didn't lower her eyes either. She simply laid the strip of hide on the table and sat back down without the tension she had before. Colt didn't say anything more. The air in the cabin shifted. Not soft, not friendly, but solid, in a way that meant none of them were pretending anymore that this was temporary. Colt dressed the meat from the rabbits and set a snare pole by the door to remind himself where traps needed checking next. Naya pulled the coat around Sira's back and sat beside her. Not as protector, but as someone finally allowed to rest without the fear of being turned out. Night came again soon. The cold followed it, but the silence between them no longer held distance. It was shared, not balanced alone. The days passed without warning, the rhythm of life settling into a quiet, unspoken routine. The snow remained firm and pale, and the wind only rose at night, cutting through the air, sharp enough that each breath reminded them of where they were. Colt Mercer didn't speak more than necessary, but his actions slowly shifted, though he never said a word to announce it. He started cutting 2 extra logs in the morning instead of 1. He mixed the last of the cornmeal evenly, making sure everyone had a share. He left his rifle within reach of all 3 of them, not just for himself. It wasn't kindness. It was simply the recognition that no one in that cabin was helpless anymore. Sira Moonshadow regained strength the fastest. By the 7th night, the rattle in her chest had thinned into a shallow cough, and she no longer shook with every step. She spoke little, just a word or two when needed, but her voice was clearer. She no longer watched the door like she expected something to break through it. Listeners might have wondered if her injuries left lasting damage, if she would walk without pain, or breathe without effort. The answer revealed itself in the way she carried the water bucket from the stove to the table one morning without swaying or gasping for air. Naya Redbird's wound closed well under the wrapping, though the scar would pull when she swung her arm too high or turned too fast. Colt checked for infection one more time and saw the skin had sealed clean. She didn't thank him, but she stopped watching his hands, like every movement had weight behind it. Trust wasn't spoken, and it didn't need to be. With food nearly gone, Colt made the decision nobody had asked for, but everyone knew was coming. "Snow will break in 2 days," he said, standing near the table with his coat half fastened. "When it does, we go east down through the low ridge to the trader's camp. I'll bring back powder beans, salt cloth, and I won't ask about names or why." He didn't tell them what he planned to do once they reached the camp, but it was clear. He wouldn't leave them behind or trade their safety for anyone's word. His voice left little doubt they were leaving, as one unit, not separate. Sira set the tin cup down and didn't look away from him when she asked, "You come back here or leave us there?" Colt answered without hesitation. "I'll bring you back. The cabin won't stand empty now." He added the final answer to the questions listeners might have had, whether he meant to abandon them once they could walk, whether their ordeal was only temporary, whether they had a place beyond survival. The answer stood as solid as his boots on the thawing floorboards that evening before the light disappeared entirely. Colt took them both outside one at a time for a longer walk past the lean-to and halfway down the frozen creek bed. Sira moved with measured confidence. Her breathing controlled her eyes, scanning the land, not for escape, but for understanding. Naya followed the creek line with her gaze, noting the blind slopes, thickets, and distances. Colt led them without explaining. He didn't need to. The land would belong to all 3 of them if they knew how to walk it. Back inside before night came full. Colt fixed one more thing that had been unfinished from the start, a second bunk. He cleared a corner near the wall opposite the stove, dragged the old bunk frame from storage, and repaired the slat he'd broken for firewood days earlier. He didn't say who would sleep there. He just laid the last good blanket across it and stepped back. Naya watched him face unreadable, then looked at Sira, who had settled into the cot with a calmer breath than any night before. Colt took the floor by the door again, same as always, but this time he set his rifle closer to their side than his own. Before the lamps dimmed, Naya spoke. Not a question, not a warning, just a mark in the silence. When the snow melts more, we help with the traps. We work, not just eat. Colt gave a single nod. You stay here. You live here. Work's part of it, Sira added, rubbing her fingers along the edge of the blanket. We don't leave. He looked at her, then at Naya, and let the weight of that silence settle the last thing unspoken. They hadn't stayed because they were too weak to leave. They stayed because they had chosen the roof that wouldn't turn them out. Night fell as it always had, quiet and cold. But now something final had settled in the air between them. Colt dressed the meat from the rabbits and set a snare pole by the door, reminding himself where traps needed checking next. Naya pulled the coat around Sira's back and sat beside her. Not as protector this time, but as someone finally allowed to rest, without fear of being turned out. When night came again, the cold followed, but the silence between them no longer held distance. It held weight shared rather than carried alone.